Okay, imagine this for a second. You arrive in a huge city today, maybe London, maybe New York, millions of people,
Right. Overwhelming.
and you need to find someone specific. Let's say your cousin who just flew in, but all you've got is their name, no phone, no address, nothing.
That sounds, well, basically impossible in today's world. A needle in a haystack doesn't even cover it.
Feels that way, yeah. Unless you tap into something else, something like relational streams.
Exactly. And that's really what we're digging into today, using some really interesting source material you shared. Notes, excerpts, really focusing on this idea.
We're looking beyond just, countries or borders. We're talking about relational streams or ethnic connections, these deep networks. Things like kinship, culture, traditions. Think tribes, maybe castes in some contexts.
And our goal really is to unpack the key insights from this material, to see just how powerful these networks are, and crucially, to see them sort of in action through a specific historical case study the sources highlight.
It's a fascinating look at these, ancient networks, some strategies that might seem really surprising to us, and maybe what it all means for how we think about connection today.
Yeah, and the thing that jumped out at me right away from the notes was the story it opens with. It really paints the picture. It's about a missionary, I think, in Port Moresby,
Right.
Papua New Guinea.
Right. Driving around with a local pastor?
Yes, and the pastor keeps pointing out women, saying, oh, there's my mother, and then again, there's another mother.
Which, understandably, kind of confused the missionary. Like, wait, how many mothers do you actually have?
Exactly, and the answer really unlocks this cultural idea. Kinship just extends way beyond our typical nuclear family.
Yeah.
Mother could be your biological mom, sure, but also aunts, other important women in the clan, that wider network. It's a powerful image of these relational streams.
And the story has a kicker, right?
It does, because later that same missionary gets a call. Someone from the Highlands needs to find a man named John in Port Moresby. Again, huge city, just a name. Knows he arrived last week. Sounds impossible again. But the source points out, by tapping into the Enga tribal families living in the city, just activating their relational stream, they found this guy, John, within an hour.
An hour, wow.
Yeah. Not by checking official records or anything like that. It was pure network navigation, understanding the human connections already there.
That anecdote just perfectly sets up the core idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the notes you shared argue pretty strongly that understanding this and actually following these relational streams, these ethne, was fundamental to how Paul operated, especially during his first missionary journey.
Right, which the material uses as the main case study, pulling from Acts 13 and 14.
Okay.
And it also touches on the debate about when Galatians was written, suggesting it might be really early, like 48, maybe 49 AD.
Which would mean what?
Well, if that date's right, it means the letter was hitting churches that were incredibly new, probably planted less than, say, a year or two before. During that journey, which likely started around 46 AD, it highlights just how fast things were moving, how quickly these communities formed.
Got it. So let's trace that journey then, like the source material suggests, looking through this relational streams lens. They start in Antioch. Paul and Barnabas get sent out. First stop, Cyprus. Why there?
Well, the material makes a specific point here. Paul had roots in Cilicia, sure, but Cyprus, that was Barnabas's home turf.
Ah, okay.
And his cousin, John Mark, who went with them initially, it was Barnabas's ethna, his network. So going there first wasn't random. It was like leveraging an existing connection, a natural starting point.
Makes sense. Start where you know people.
Exactly. And on Cyprus, they didn't just preach randomly on street corners. The notes emphasize they went to the synagogues. Salamis, other cities.
Right.
And the argument presented is that synagogues weren't just for Jewish people. They were established community hubs, access points, really. You had Jews, yes, but also these God-fearing Gentiles, non-Jews, who were drawn to Jewish monotheism and were already sort of connected to that community.
So they were finding people already receptive within these existing streams.
Precisely. And they moved across the island, planting churches, and eventually they get to New Paphos, the Roman capital.
And that's where the big conversion happens.
That's the one, Sergius Paulus, the proconsul, the top Roman guy on the island. A huge deal.
Okay, so here's where the source material really makes you stop and think. It poses this big question. They've just had this massive success, right?
Yeah.
The governor converts. You'd think, okay, now you consolidate.
Yeah, dig in, disciple this influential guy, build up the churches across Cyprus. Seems logical.
But they don't do that at all. What happens instead?
This is what the material calls their strange strategies, because almost immediately after Sergius Paulus converts, they leave Cyprus.
Leave just like that?
Yep. sail north to the mainland. And they don't even stop in the easy port cities along the coasts. They head straight inland, like 150 kilometers, 90 miles or so,
Wow.
through really difficult, mountainous, apparently dangerous territory to a place called Pisidian Antioch. It's such a sudden, hard move that John Mark actually bails at this point. He turns back.
That just seems counterproductive. Reckless, even.
Yeah.
Why rush off like that, especially inland? What's the logic the source finds here?
Okay, so the notes lay out 3 key principles they see at work. Principles they say are maybe radical to us now, but were foundational to Jesus' mission. And Paul picked them up.
All right. What's the first one?
First, immediately involving new believers in mission. The source actually suggests Sergius Paulus himself, this brand new convert, might be the key.
How so?
Pisidian Antioch. The theory is that it was his home colony, maybe where his family was from, where his influence network on the mainland was centered.
Ah, so he wasn't just a convert, he was potentially a bridge.
Exactly. Like, remember how Jesus involved the Samaritan woman right away? Go tell your village, or the guy healed from demons. Go tell your region. The idea is Paul might have seen Sergius Paulus as the person to open the door to his network inland.
So the new believer becomes part of the mission expansion strategy, like instantly.
Instantly, which connects to the second principle, which feels even bolder, giving new believers full responsibility.
Full responsibility, straight away.
That's the argument. By leaving Cyprus so quickly, Paul and Barnabas didn't create dependency. They basically forced participation. The new disciples on Cyprus, they got the core message, the essential truths, and then boom, full ownership, total responsibility for the mission right there in their context. The notes argue this pressure is actually vital for real spiritual growth.
That sounds incredibly risky. I mean, trusting brand new believers, probably facing pressure themselves with everything.
It feels risky to us, yeah. And the third strategy ties it together, unstintingly pursuing relational streams. Sergius Paulus isn't just an influential convert. The source presents him as what they call a person of peace.
Like in the Gospels, where Jesus tells disciples to find someone receptive who can open doors.
Precisely that model, an influential person who can provide access to whole new networks. So, the sudden move to Pisidian Antioch, his likely home base or family connection, is seen as Paul deliberately following that relational stream inland, seeking out the next connection point.
Okay, so these rapid, maybe counterintuitive moves get new converts involved immediately, give them the keys to the car right away, and follow these key relational connectors into new territory. These are presented as deliberate core strategies, not just random decisions.
That's the picture the source material paints. And they apparently applied the same kind of approach in Pisidian Antioch, then Iconium, then Lystra. Again, the synagogues often seem to be the starting point.
The access points.
Right. Access to receptive Jews, but maybe even more importantly, to those God-fearing Gentiles already connected and curious.
And Paul's message, like in Pisidian Antioch that the source highlights, was really inclusive from the get-go, wasn't it? He addresses men of Israel and you Gentiles who worship God.
Yes, and the notes emphasize how the God-fearing Gentiles especially seem to really embrace the message, joyfully, openly, which led to the word spreading rapidly.
But that success caused problems. Big problems. Intense opposition flared up fast. Jealousy, it seems, from some within the established Jewish communities who saw Gentiles flocking to this new message. They stirred up local leaders.
So Paul and Barnabas got pushed out.
Pushed out, persecuted, and in Lystra it got really violent. Paul was stoned, dragged out of the city, left for dead.
Which brings us to the absolute core puzzle the source material tackles, and it's a big one. How did these brand new churches planted super fast in pagan cities, facing immediate violent opposition, how did they possibly survive, let alone flourish, after the apostles were literally run out of town? It seems completely improbable.
It really does, by our usual metrics. And the material digs into Acts to find the reasons. And the first point is crucial. Their survival didn't depend on Paul and Barnabas sticking around.
Okay, so what did it depend on?
Well, Acts says the word of the Lord spread through the whole region. The message itself, empowered, was the driving force.
The foundation was the word, not the personalities. Exactly, and these weren't just passive converts sitting around waiting for instructions. The material really stresses this. The new disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Their energy, their resilience, it came from within, from God, not from constant outside management.
Internal power source, essentially.
I mean, you could say that. And it wasn't just a few people. Acts mentions a great number believed, both Jews and Gentiles. And this is key. The message wasn't just words. It was confirmed by miraculous signs and wonders.
Ah, so there was tangible evidence. People were seeing God's power at work.
Yes, powerful, visible confirmation that this wasn't just another philosophy. God was actively involved. And when they did appoint elders later, circling back through, the notes suggest these leaders weren't just capable guys. They were people deeply committed to the Lord in whom they had put their trust.
Trust in the Lord, not just trust in the apostles or the system.
That's the core argument. The whole movement was rooted in trusting the Lord and His Word. They found their joy in God's grace, which the miracles demonstrated not in their own efforts or in relying on the apostles to keep things afloat. They were filled with the Holy Spirit, empowered directly.
So Paul and Barnabas could leave. Why?
The source concludes they could leave because these new believers were genuine, grounded. They were trusting the Lord. They had His Word. They were filled with the Spirit, filled with joy, even amid hardship.
So the job was complete. Not because everything was perfectly organized by our standards, but because the new churches were fully handed the reins, given total responsibility for the mission in their own networks, their own relational streams.
Exactly. Which, the notes briefly mentioned, gives context to that letter to the Galatians. Even with this amazing Spirit-filled start, challenges came quickly. Paul writes, maybe just a year later, really distressed because they were being swayed by a different gospel.
Ah, so empowerment didn't mean invulnerability.
Right. Especially, it seems, pressures targeting the Gentiles and the freedom they'd found in the message. It shows the reality of the struggle, even with such a strong foundation.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the really big takeaways from this deep dive into the source material?
I think first, just the sheer power and importance of these relational streams, these ethnic connections, understanding those underlying networks, and then what the source frames as Paul's really radical strategies.
Yeah, those strange strategies.
Right. Getting new believers involved immediately, like day one, giving them full responsibility, not just partial tasks, and constantly, relentlessly pursuing those relational connections through key people.
And the other huge piece is why it worked, why these churches survived against the odds. The material argues it wasn't about the apostle staying, it was about the power of the word itself spreading.
The new disciples actively trusting God and His Word, being genuinely filled with the Holy Spirit and joy.
Seeing God's grace confirmed through miracles, and crucially, being given that total responsibility for the mission in their own context. It paints a picture of reliance on God's power and local empowerment, not external human control.
Which definitely brings it back to us today, doesn't it? Back to you listening. Why does wrestling with these dynamics from nearly 2,000 years ago matter now?
It really makes you question our own approaches.
Yeah.
What if we focused more on these relational streams, the real networks people operate in? Families, workplaces, online groups, cultural connections. How might that change how you think about sharing an idea or building a community or launching something new?
Are we building formal structures and just hoping people show up? Or are we looking for the natural connectors, the Sergis policies within existing networks and empowering them?
And that idea of giving new people full responsibility so quickly, wow, that feels so counter to how we usually do things, with all our stages and training and oversight.
It really does.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with, building on this material, is this. What would it look like to design something, maybe a community project, a business, a creative venture, anything with the explicit goal of self-sustaining growth and mission right from the start, instead of building something that depends on constant outside propping up?
Yeah, how might that shift things if the focus from day one was activating and empowering people within their own networks to carry it forward? What might that change?